The weight of empty rooms' rain whispered against the tall windows of the Ashford residence, a sprawling estate perched on the edge of Seattle's forgotten coastline. Inside, everything gleamed with the kind of perfection that money could buy but loneliness couldn't fill. The man who lived there had stopped counting the days after his wife died. Time had become something that simply passed, like the fog that rolled in from Puget Sound each evening, thick and inevitable. Daniel Ashford sat in his study, surrounded by leather-bound books he no longer read and awards he no longer remembered earning. At 42, he looked older. Grief had carved lines into his face that success never touched. His architectural firm still bore his name, but he hadn't designed anything in 2 years. Not since the accident, not since Catherine. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 7, its chime echoing through rooms that felt too large for one person. Daniel poured himself a glass of scotch, the same ritual he performed every evening, though he rarely finished it. The taste reminded him too much of celebration, and celebration felt like a betrayal. A soft knock interrupted the silence. "Mr. Ashford?" The voice belonged to his housekeeper, though she was new enough that he sometimes forgot her name. No, he remembered now. Elena Vasquez. "I've finished with the kitchen. Is there anything else you need before I go?" He turned to see her standing in the doorway, a woman in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back and eyes that seemed to notice everything. She'd been working here for 3 weeks, sent by the same agency that had provided 5 others before her. The others had all quit, citing various reasons. The house felt heavy, one said. Another claimed it was too quiet. The truth was simpler. They couldn't stand watching a man disappear into his own grief. "No, thank you," Daniel said, his voice rough from disuse. "You can leave." Elena nodded, but she didn't move right away. Instead, her gaze drifted to the photograph on his desk, the one he kept face down but somehow always ended up right side up again, Catherine on their wedding day laughing at something beyond the frame. "She was beautiful," Elena said quietly. Daniel stiffened. Most people avoided mentioning Catherine as if her name was a wound that shouldn't be touched. "Yes, she was. I lost someone too," Elena continued, surprising him. "My husband. 3 years ago. Heart attack. He was 31. Something in her voice, steady but not pitying, made Daniel look at her properly for the first time. She wasn't offering sympathy. She was offering recognition. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "So am I," she replied. "But sorry doesn't fill the quiet, does it?" He found himself almost smiling. "No, it doesn't." Elena adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "The pasta I made is in the fridge. You should eat it while it's still good. Not everything needs to go cold." The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than they should. Before Daniel could respond, she was gone, her footsteps soft against the marble floor, the front door clicking shut behind her. He sat in the silence she left behind, which somehow felt different than the silence before. The pasta, when he heated it an hour later, tasted better than anything he'd eaten in months. He wondered if that was because she'd made it or because someone had cared enough to tell him to eat it. The next evening, Elena arrived at 6, as scheduled. She moved through the house with quiet efficiency, dusting shelves that didn't need dusting, organizing spaces that were already organized. Daniel watched her from his study, noticing the way she opened curtains he always kept closed, letting the gray Seattle light filter in. "You don't like the dark?" he asked, appearing in the doorway. She glanced back at him. "I don't think anyone really likes it. They just get used to it. Maybe some things should stay closed." "Maybe," she agreed, running her cloth along the windowsill. "But not windows. Windows are meant to show you what's outside, even when you don't want to look." That night, as she prepared to leave, Daniel found himself saying, "Would you stay for dinner?" Elena paused, her hand on the doorknob. "Mr. Ashford, I don't think that's appropriate." "It's just dinner," he said quickly. "There's too much food. I'd rather not eat alone again." She studied him for a long moment, and he wasn't sure what she saw. A lonely man, probably. A client crossing boundaries. Or maybe she saw what he felt but couldn't name. Someone drowning in a house full of memories, reaching for anything that felt like air. "1 hour," she finally said. "And then I need to get home to my daughter." "You have a daughter?" "Rosie, she's 7. My mother watches her while I work." They ate at the kitchen table, not the formal dining room. Elena heated the leftover pasta and made a simple salad. They talked about small things. Her daughter's love of drawing, his abandoned blueprints, the weather that never seemed to change in this part of the world. For the first time in 2 years, Daniel laughed. actually laughed. It was a small sound, rusty and uncertain, but it was real. When Elena left that night, she turned back at the door. "Tomorrow I'll make something different. If you'd like." "I'd like that," Daniel said. The pattern began simply. Elena would finish her work, and Daniel would ask her to stay just for a little while. Just for dinner, just until the rain stopped. Just until the quiet didn't feel so sharp. She always hesitated, always reminded him of the professional distance they should maintain. But she always stayed. They fell into an easy rhythm, these evening conversations. Elena talked about Rosie, about the life she was building from pieces of loss. Daniel talked about Catherine, slowly at first, then more freely. About how she'd loved thunderstorms and hated coffee but drank it anyway. About the house they'd designed together. Every room a conversation they'd had in blueprints and dreams. "You built this for her," Elena said one evening, looking around the kitchen. "We built it together," Daniel corrected. "She wanted windows everywhere. Said life was too short to hide from the light." "She sounds wise." She was. He paused. "She would have liked you," Elena smiled softly. "I wish I could have known her." 3 months passed this way. The house began to change in small ways. Flowers appeared on the dining table. Music played softly from the speakers Catherine had picked out. The curtains stayed open. Daniel started sketching again, nothing serious. Just lines on paper that might someday become something real. One evening, as the rain fell harder than usual, Daniel looked across the table at Elena and realized something that both terrified and awakened him. He didn't want her to leave. Not just tonight, but ever. She'd become the thing that made the silence bearable, the presence that reminded him what living felt like. "Stay," he said, the word catching in his throat. "I always do," Elena replied with a gentle smile. "No, I mean truly stay. Not just for dinner, stay here. You and Rosie. There's more than enough room." Elena's expression shifted, something between surprise and sadness crossing her face. "Mr. Ashford, Daniel, I can't do that. Why not?" "Because you're not asking me to stay. You're asking me to fill a space that belongs to someone else." The truth of it hit him like cold water. He sat back, shame and realization washing over him in equal measure. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "You're right." Elena reached across the table, her hand covering his. "I care about you, I do. But you need to figure out who you are without her before you can figure out who you might be with someone new. This house, these dinners, they're beautiful, but they're still hers. And I can't be a ghost." That night, Elena left earlier than usual. Daniel sat in the empty kitchen, the rain drumming against windows that Catherine had wanted and Elena had opened. For the first time, he understood the difference between not wanting to be alone and truly wanting to be with someone. Learning to build. Again, the morning after Elena's refusal, Daniel woke to a house that felt different. Not emptier, different. The realization she'd left him with had lodged itself somewhere deep, uncomfortable and true. She was right. This entire house was a shrine, and he'd been living in it like a ghost himself. He walked through each room, really seeing them for the first time in months. Catherine's art books still lined the shelves exactly as she'd arranged them. Her reading glasses sat on the nightstand, waiting for eyes that would never use them again. Even the guest rooms remained untouched, preserved as if she might walk through the door and need everything exactly where she'd left it. Elena still came to work, but something had shifted between them. She was professional, kind, but distant in a way that made Daniel ache. They no longer shared dinner. She finished her duties and left promptly at 7, offering only a polite goodbye. A week passed this way, then 2. Daniel found himself standing in front of Catherine's closet one afternoon, hand on the doorknob, heart pounding. He'd avoided this room since she died, letting her clothes hang undisturbed, her perfume bottles gather dust. Opening it felt like an ending he wasn't ready for, but Elena's words echoed in his mind. "You need to figure out who you are without her." He opened the door. The scent hit him first, familiar and devastating. He sank onto the bench where Catherine used to sit while putting on her shoes, and he wept. Not the silent tears he'd shed before, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. He cried for the life they'd planned and lost. He cried for the man he'd been with her and the hollow shell he'd become without her. He cried because letting go felt like betrayal, but holding on was slowly killing him. When the tears finally stopped, he called his sister for the first time in a year. "Daniel?" Marie's voice was cautious, surprised. "Is everything okay?" No, he said honestly. But I think I'm ready for it not to be okay anymore. Marie came the next day with boxes and tissue paper and the kind of gentle determination only siblings possess. Together, they went through Catherine's things. Her favorite sweater went into a box marked Keep. The dress she'd worn to their anniversary dinner 2 months before she died was carefully folded for donation. Her jewelry was set aside for Marie's daughter, who Catherine had loved like her own. You don't have to get rid of everything, Marie said softly, watching Daniel hesitate over a stack of books. I know, he replied, but I can't keep everything either. That's not living. That's just curating a museum. They worked through the weekend. Daniel told stories as they sorted, remembering Catherine in words instead of objects. How she'd insisted on buying ridiculous throw pillows shaped like animals. How she'd burned dinner so often they'd joked about installing a second smoke alarm. How she'd hold his face in her hands and tell him to stop designing monuments and start designing homes. She wouldn't want this, Daniel said, looking around the emptier bedroom. She'd hate knowing I stopped living because she did. She'd hate it, Marie agreed. But she'd also understand. Grief doesn't follow rules, Daniel. It just follows us until we learn to walk beside it instead of behind it. On Monday, when Elena arrived, she stopped in the entryway, noticing the changes immediately. Boxes lined the hall, marked for charity. The photographs had been rearranged, not hidden, but integrated into the space rather than dominating it. The air itself felt different, as if the house had exhaled after holding its breath for 2 years. You've been busy, she said carefully. I took your advice, Daniel replied. I'm trying to figure out who I am without her. Elena set down her cleaning supplies, her expression softening. How does it feel? Terrifying, he admitted. Like I'm erasing her. You're not erasing her. You're making room to remember her differently. They stood in the quiet for a moment, and Daniel felt the distance between them shrink slightly. I owe you an apology, he said. I asked you to stay for the wrong reasons. I was trying to replace what I lost instead of accepting that it's gone. I know, Elena said gently, and I'm sorry if I was harsh. You weren't, you were honest. That's rarer than kindness. Elena smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. Can I help? With the sorting, I mean, if you want company. I'd like that, Daniel said. They worked side by side throughout the day, a comfortable silence settling between them. Elena shared stories of her own sorting after her husband died, the things she'd kept and the things she'd let go. Daniel listened, understanding for the first time that grief was a country everyone visited, but no one stayed in the same way. As weeks passed, the house transformed. Daniel hired a company to repaint the living room, changing Catherine's preferred sage green to a warm cream. He moved the piano she'd never learned to play into storage and replaced it with a drafting table. Slowly, the house became his, not theirs, not hers. His. He started designing again, small projects at first, a community center for Marie's neighborhood, a renovation for a local bookstore. The lines on paper felt foreign at first, but gradually his hand remembered what his heart had forgotten. He'd loved this work before Catherine, and he could love it after her. Elena noticed these changes without comment, but her presence at the house began to feel less like duty and more like choice. She started staying a few minutes longer after work, not for dinner but for conversation. They'd stand in the kitchen while she wiped down counters, talking about Rosie's school play or Daniel's latest design challenge. One evening, Daniel showed her the sketches for a new project, a grief counseling center designed with windows that looked out onto a garden. Catherine wanted our house to have light everywhere, he explained. I'm trying to give that to other people, spaces where they can see outside even when everything inside feels dark. Elena studied the drawings, her finger tracing the lines. This is beautiful. She'd be proud. You think so? I know so. You're taking what you learned from loving her and giving it to the world. That's not forgetting. That's honoring. Something in Daniel's chest loosened, a knot he hadn't known he was carrying. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I was lost. Everyone gets lost, Elena said. The important part is finding your way back. That night she stayed for tea, just tea, nothing more. They sat in the newly painted living room, talking until the rain stopped and stars appeared through the windows. When she left, Daniel didn't ask her to stay. He simply thanked her for the evening and meant it. He was learning the difference between loneliness and solitude, between filling silence and sitting with it. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum. It felt like a space between what was and what might be, and for the first time since Catherine died, Daniel felt ready to inhabit that space. He began taking morning walks along the coast, something Catherine had always wanted him to do but he'd been too busy for. He reconnected with old friends, said yes to invitations he'd been declining for 2 years. He even went on a date, awkward and brief. But it reminded him he could still be a person in the world, not just a man haunted by his own home. Through it all, Elena remained a steady presence, no longer the lifeline he was clinging to, but a friend who understood what it meant to rebuild from ruins. They developed an easy friendship, one built on shared loss and mutual respect rather than need and desperation. One afternoon, Daniel found her in the garden, kneeling beside the roses Catherine had planted years ago. They'd grown wild in the neglect, thorny and overgrown. "I didn't know you gardened," he said. "I don't really," Elena admitted, "but these looked like they needed someone to care." "Is that okay?" "More than okay," Daniel said, kneeling beside her. "Catherine loved these roses. I've been too afraid to touch them." Together they pruned the dead branches and cleared away the weeds. Elena showed him how to cut at an angle, how to remove what was dying to make room for new growth. As they worked, Daniel realized this was exactly what he'd been doing with his own life, cutting away what couldn't survive and trusting that something new would bloom. "Elena," he said as they stood, dirt under their nails and satisfaction in the work completed, "would you and Rosie like to come for dinner this weekend? As friends, I mean. I'd like you to see the house as it is now, not as it was." Elena considered this, her expression thoughtful. "As friends?" "As friends," he confirmed. "I'm not trying to fill a space anymore. I'm just trying to build something new." She smiled, and in that smile was recognition, understanding, and possibility. "We'd like that." What Remains and What Grows Saturday arrived with unexpected sunshine, rare for Seattle in autumn. Daniel spent the morning preparing, not with the nervous energy of someone trying to impress, but with the careful attention of someone who wanted to share something meaningful. He cooked simple food, roasted chicken, vegetables from the farmer's market, bread from the bakery Catherine had loved. Not because she'd loved it, but because he did too, and it was time to claim these small joys as his own. When the doorbell rang at 6, he opened it to find Elena with a little girl hiding partly behind her legs. Rosie had her mother's dark hair and eyes that held both curiosity and caution. "Hello," Daniel said, crouching to her level. "You must be Rosie. Your mom has told me a lot about you." "She told me about you too," Rosie said, her voice small but clear. "She said you're learning how to be happy again." Daniel glanced up at Elena, who looked slightly embarrassed but didn't correct her daughter. "That's right," he said to Rosie. "It takes practice, but I'm getting better at it. My mom says practice makes permanent, not perfect." "Your mom sounds very wise." "She is," Rosie said with the absolute certainty of childhood. They ate dinner in the kitchen, the same table where Daniel and Elena had shared so many meals, but this time it felt entirely different. Rosie chattered about school, about her best friend who was moving away, about the cat she desperately wanted but couldn't have because their apartment didn't allow pets. Elena listened with the patient attention of a mother who'd heard these stories before but loved them anyway. Daniel found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't expected. This wasn't a replacement family or a second chance at what he'd lost. It was simply an evening with people whose company he enjoyed, whose presence made the house feel lived in, rather than haunted. After dinner, Rosie noticed the drafting table by the window. "Are you an artist?" she asked. "An architect," Daniel explained. "I design buildings. Can you draw me one?" He smiled. "What kind of building would you like?" "A castle," she said immediately, "but with lots of windows so the princess can see outside." Daniel pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began sketching while Rosie watched, fascinated. Elena cleared the dishes quietly, and for a moment, the scene felt almost ordinary. A child's wonder, a mother's gentle movements, a man's hands creating something just for the joy of it. "There," Daniel said, showing Rosie the quick sketch. "A castle with windows in every room." "It's perfect," she breathed, holding the paper like treasure. "Can I keep it?" "Of course." After Rosie fell asleep on the couch, surrounded by cushions and covered with a blanket Elena kept in her car, The two adults sat on the back patio, watching the city lights reflect off the sound. "Thank you for this," Elena said.
She needed a good day.
"We both did." "So did I," Daniel admitted. "This house has felt like a monument for so long. Tonight it just felt like a home. That's because you're finally living in it instead of preserving it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while before Elena spoke again. Her voice thoughtful. "You know, when I first started working here, I thought you were the saddest person I'd ever met. Not in a pitying way, but in a recognizable way. I saw myself in you 3 years earlier, just going through motions and calling it life." "What changed for you?" Daniel asked. "Rosie mostly. I couldn't stay frozen because she needed me to keep moving. But also I realized that my husband wouldn't have wanted me to build a shrine to our marriage. He'd have wanted me to take what we had and use it to build something new, not instead of what we had, but because of it. That's what you've been trying to teach me," Daniel said. "I've been trying to share what I learned. There's a difference." "Elena," he said carefully, "I need you to know that what I feel now, it's not what I felt 3 months ago. I'm not looking for someone to fill Catherine's place. I'm looking for someone who makes me want to build a new place entirely." She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I care about you, not because you remind me of what I lost or because you're here when I'm lonely. I care about you because you're funny and wise and you see things clearly even when they're hard to look at. I care about you because when you're here, I'm not trying to remember how to live. I'm just living." Elena was quiet for a long moment, and Daniel's heart hammered with the fear that he'd misread everything, said too much too soon. "I care about you too," she finally said. "But I need you to be sure. Not sure about us necessarily, but sure about yourself. I won't be someone's transition. I won't be the person who helps you heal only to realize you needed to heal alone." "I understand," Daniel said. "And you're right to be careful. I'm still figuring out who I am in this new life. But I know I want you in it, however that looks." "As friends?" Elena asked. "As friends," he confirmed. "And maybe someday as more, if we both want that, but only if we both want it for the right reasons." Elena smiled, and it was the kind of smile that held both relief and hope. "I'd like that. The friendship now and the maybe later." They sat together until the night grew cold, talking about small things and large ones, about Rosie's upcoming birthday and Daniel's new project and what it meant to love people after loss. When Elena finally woke Rosie and gathered their things to leave, Daniel walked them to the door. "Same time next week?" he asked. "As friends," Elena confirmed. "As friends," he agreed. Over the following months, they built something careful and real. Saturday dinners became tradition. Daniel taught Rosie to draw building elevations, and she taught him the names of constellations. Elena brought her grandmother's recipes, and they cooked together, the kitchen filling with laughter and the smell of cumin and cilantro. Daniel finished the grief counseling center and dedicated it to Catherine's memory, not as a monument to his pain, but as a gift born from what she'd taught him about light and space and the importance of windows. At the opening, Elena stood beside him with Rosie, and for the first time, it felt natural to introduce her as someone important in his life. Not just his housekeeper, but his friend. Sometimes Daniel still had hard days when the weight of loss pressed down unexpectedly. On those days, Elena didn't try to fix him or rush him through it. She simply sat with him, understanding that grief doesn't disappear. It just learns to coexist with joy. And sometimes Elena had hard days too, memories of her husband surfacing in unexpected moments. Daniel learned to recognize them, to offer the same steady presence she'd given him, proof that healing wasn't a solo journey, but something done in the company of people who understood. One spring evening, nearly a year after that first dinner with Rosie, they stood in the garden where the roses now bloomed wild and beautiful. Rosie was inside drawing, and the house glowed warm behind them. "I'm ready," Daniel said quietly. "For what?" Elena asked. "For more than friendship. If you are. Not because I'm lonely or trying to fill a space, but because I love who I am when I'm with you. Because you make me want to keep building, keep growing, keep living." Elena turned to face him fully, her eyes searching his. Whatever she found there must have been enough because she smiled, genuine and unguarded. "I'm ready too," she said. "I've been ready for a while. I was just waiting for you to catch up." He laughed, pulling her close. "I'm a slow learner. You're worth the wait." They stood in the garden as the last light faded, Two people who'd lost everything and found not a replacement but something entirely new. The courage to try again, to risk loving when loving meant risking loss, to build a life that honored the past without being trapped in it. Inside, Rosie called out that she'd finished her drawing, and they went in together, ready for whatever came next. The house that had once been a monument to grief had become a home filled with possibility. And Daniel finally understood what Catherine had tried to teach him all along. That love doesn't end when people leave. It transforms, growing in new directions, taking new shapes, making room for new light. In the end, Elena had been right. Some things were meant to stay closed, but windows were meant to show you what's outside, even when you don't want to look. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to keep looking, you find something worth opening the door for. The roses bloomed, the house breathed, and life, that stubborn, persistent thing, continued. Not despite the loss, but carrying it gently, the way you'd carry a photograph, something precious that shaped you but didn't define your every step forward. They had learned what remained was not just memory, but the capacity to love again, differently this time, but no less real. And that was enough. That was everything. The end.